Amesy here of Amesy's Antics. Welcome to my channel. I hope you're well today because I have another crafty project to share with you. And in this week's video, I am weaving a wall hanging for the first time and showing you 5 weaving techniques to try to create your own. Now you may remember a few months ago I had several Etsy craft kits to try out, and this is the final one out of the 5 or 6 that I purchased. So if you would like to see how to make your own wall hanging using some 5 different weaving techniques, then let's get crafting. So here is the weaving kit, and this is by Wool Couture over on Etsy, and I will link it down below if you want to check it out for yourself. And this has everything we need to create the weaving wall hanging. But before we do any weaving, we need to sort out the loom and get it threaded up. So what you use to thread the loom is warp thread. Now warp thread is basically a thicker cotton thread that can withstand the pressure of weaving in and out. It is thicker than a sewing thread but not as thick as wool. It's quite nice. This one is cotton. So what you want to do is just tie it on the first notch, double knotting it so it's secure, and then to actually thread it up you want to take it down and thread it into one of the notches and round to the other one, back up, repeating the same as you go along. And I think I do it slightly wrong here, but I think I rectify it later on. What you want to do, you make sure all the loops are on the back of the loom, not on the top, so all the loops are in the same direction, I guess. But yes, thread it up, and then once you have threaded it, you then want to just tie the opposite side in a knot to secure it onto the loom on that side. The first weaving technique that I'm going to show you is the plain weave, and this is one of the most basic weaving weaves that you can do, and it is easy to master and gives some structure and that weaving pattern that you sort of know of a weave. So all you want to do is thread the weaving needle with enough of your wool or weft. So going across is called the weft, and you basically take this needle up and down in between the warp threads so that it alternates between front and back. Then once you get to the end, you want to curve this up and weave again in the opposite direction. However, you want to make sure this is opposite to what you have already woven, because if you do it the same it will just unravel everything. And then what you want to do is use that weaving comb just to press it down into place and make it all secure. This weave is one of the basic ones, as I've said, but it also helps secure in other techniques like this one. So to add a little bit of definition to the wall hanging, I'm going to use another technique called raya knot or raya knot. I'm not quite sure how it's pronounced, but these are basically adding on pieces of wool that look a bit like a tassel, and it really gives something nice to the bottom of that wall hanging. Now before you can complete a raya knot, you need to create that plain weave to hold it in place, and then you want to cut down your pieces of wool, and mine are about 15 centimeters long each, and I use 11 to create 2 rows of these raya knots. So what you want to do is select 2 of the warp threads, pull these up and wrap around that wool so one trailing bit is on top and the underneath bit comes to the right side of those warp threads. Then what you want to do is take the remaining part and wrap it around the next 2 warp threads, bringing it again into that middle part of the left hand side of these threads and pulling it slightly so it's a bit taut and becomes this tassel like shape. And you want to keep going until you reach the end of the row, but what you will notice is it doesn't quite fill the whole row. So what I'm doing to secure these ones in place is doing another one of that plain weave and then adding on a few more of the raya knots in between the ones that are already done. So selecting 2 of the warp threads again and on the opposite side creating these lovely raya knots, and these do thicken over time because as the wool sort of untwines a little bit, it gives a little bit more chunkiness to the bottom of that wall hanging, and I think it's a really nice technique and quite easy once you get going with it. And then here I'm just adding a little bit more of that plain weave just to, one, secure the wire knots in place, and two, just because I wanted to practice the plain weave, and it gave a nice little look to the bottom of this wall hanging. And because I'd done a few rows of the plain weave, I then wanted to add a little bit more definition once again, and I'm using a technique called the Sumac weave, or the braided weave I think it is called. So this basically braids around the wool, and what you should do, what I don't do, is actually cut some of your wool down so you have a long tail to do this. I am just taking the whole of my ball of wool through. But what you want to do is select 2 of the warp threads, place your wool through this, leaving a tail at the front, and then on the next 2 warp threads you want to wrap the the working end of the yarn all the way through. And this is where my mistake comes, because it just takes me forever. So my advice, cut it down. But yes, what you do is pull all that wool through, and it gives this like looped look. Then what you want to do is take that working end once again and take it to the next loop, like so, wrapping it around and pulling all that working end back through once again, and keep going until you get to the length that you want to do this, either end of the row or, like I did, to sort of middle part of the loom. And once you get to the end bit of that row, you then want to loop it twice around them last warp strings. So the last one will be wrapped around twice. And then what you can do is actually go backwards to the start of that to create a second row, and this will give it that really nice braided look. But what you need to remember is, when you are doing this, you always have the working end going in the opposite direction to the way you are moving. So that's how I remembered this one. So you take it up through that warp thread twice when you get to the end, and then pull it through the next 2, but pull it the opposite way that you are going, if that makes sense. Hopefully you can get a little bit of a gist from this, because it feels a bit complicated to explain, but it's not actually that complicated, I don't think. But yes, this is just how you complete the sumac or the braided weave. And then, because I only did half of the loom with that sumac, I just finished off that row with some plain weave with a different coloured wool, and interlocked this in a little bit, and then added a little bit more definition with some more sumac weave a little bit further up, finishing off filling in the void from the other half with a bit more of the plain weave to give it sort of like a bit of a different level and gradient to the wall hanging. And then for the next 2 rows, I'm going to add a little bit more definition to the wall hanging by using another technique of adding roving wool. Now, roving wool is basically unspun wool, and it's in the thicker form, so it's quite a chunky wool. Think about that chunky knit blanket that I made. So yes, it was a bit too thick. You do get quite a lot in the pack, so I've just taken a split of this off from the main bit, and then I'm doing like a plain weave by weaving the roving wool under 2 warp threads, and then over 2 warp threads, and then under 2 warp threads, and over 2 warp threads. And this just gives a little bit of definition, and because the space in between the warp threads is a bit bigger, you can then pull some of that roving wool through, and it just gives a really nice sort of bubbled up effect to the wool, and I think it looks lovely. You can leave it like this because it's definition enough like this, but you just need to pinch the wool to bring it up, and it gives it a really nice look. Then all you want to do is the tail ends, you just want to tuck them back. I forgot to mention this before. Just tuck all your working ends to the back of the loom, and we'll sort them out at the end. But yes, this is a really nice way of adding some definition. And just to secure this in place, you want to also add a bit of the plain weave, and I am actually matching the colour wool to that roving wool, just so it blends it in a little bit better and it hides it. So I've done 2 rows of that, then added in another row of the roving wool and finishing that off with some plain weave to secure it in place. For the next weaving technique, you just want to weave through a few layers or rows of the plain weave, and then for the 3rd row you want to grab a pencil or a dowel, because we're going to create a pile weave, and this basically creates lots of loops. So you want to take your pencil or dowel, and on that 3rd row you then want to every other warp thread, so maybe like the down warp threads, I might miss a few here because it's a bit like knitting is this one, I feel, but you just wrap your working thread around every other warp thread and keep going until you reach the end of the row. Now what's important here, you keep quite a long bit of the wool through that loom so that you can get the correct tension. You don't want it too tight, but you don't want it too loose. And if the tighter it is, the harder it is to push that pencil or dowel through. You could also use a pen if it is long enough, but I found the pencil worked really well. So just keep wrapping it around, creating all these loops, and then finish off the next row with a plain weave or 2 and push it down with your weaving comb, and this will just secure that pile weave in place because it is quite a loose weave once it goes, and the plain weave really does secure a lot in place. Once you have a few rows, you can then pull out that pencil and you can see we have created lots of nice little loops, and that is the pile weave, and it adds a great bit of definition that's a little bit different from the rest of the weaving techniques that we've used. And this bit sort of comes over the adding in the roving wool. I'm just using a bit more of that roving wool and trying to create a little bit of a different bit of definition. So I've got a slimmer piece and then I am just passing it through. I think I'm doing every 2 warp threads here just to create another bit of definition, but I'm only going to do it halfway and really push it down so that it fits down into that loom. And then because we've got quite a little bit extra left over, I'm going to then weave a few more rows using the same sort of plain 2 warp thread weave, and it creates this really cool bubbly look, but it's got like, I don't know how it reminds me a little bit of honeycomb like style to it, and I really like this effect. So if you do want to get a little bit of an effect like this, you just need to do a few layers of that roving or rows of the roving wool, and it'll give you this really nice sort of woven look. I like it. So yes, keep going until you get the desired look that you like, I guess. And then for the opposite side, I wanted to use some more of that roving wool. So this time I have woven it in 1 warp at a time rather than the 2, and I've done 2 rows of this, and then I've alternated pulling a little bit of it out, so it's like got a bit of a up down look to the bubble. And then just to secure everything in place, I am just doing a few rows of the plain weave, and then this will finish off the wall hanging, and we are ready to take it off of the loom once we have tucked all of these end bits in, which is a little bit of a chaos. So what you want to do is thread, if you can, the tail end of the wool and bring this through some of those warp threads just to secure it. You only have to go through a few and then you can cut it down and it should stay in place once it is woven through. So keep going until all of your end pieces are either fully woven in or woven in a little bit and then snipped down like this. The woven wool is a little bit different because it's thicker, but if you can, try and thread it through the needle and then pass it through some of them warp threads once again. It should stay in place because it is so chunky. It does stay in place, and just be mindful of not pulling it too tight because it can alter the shape at the sides, or it could pull some of your weaving through and not give the desired look that you want. So keep checking the front as you are adding these bits in, and keep going until all the ends are neatly tucked away, sort of, and you know which is the back and which is the front now as well. And then it's time to remove it from that loom. So what you want to do is select the loops that the warp thread is on the ends of the notches and just cut these in the middle to create 2 parts. And then what you want to do is double knot these to secure it all tightly and keep all that weaving in place. Now I'm not going to lie, this bit is really fiddly and it took me a while to do these, but yes, keep going until they are all knotted and double check that they are fully secured, because when I went to trim them down later on, 1 or 2 did come undone and I had to try and tie them once they'd already been trimmed. So yes, don't do that. Once you have them all taken off, you then want to just trim them down to a few millimeters, and that is the weaving secured off of the loom. And then to actually be able to hang the wall hanging, you want to add it to a mount that can be hung. Now I think this would look really good with a bit of driftwood because it's got that beachy look. But anyway, I'm using the one that come in the kit. So what you want to do is thread your weaving needle with the warp thread, and then you want to take this through with enough length through the first warp thread that has been knotted, bringing this up and around the back of the mount, bring it down the front and then through the next warp thread on that sort of chain, and keep going in this fashion until you reach the end, and then you want to knot both ends securely to keep it all in place. Now I found this quite fiddly again, and I don't think it's probably because of the length of twine that I am using here, which makes it a little bit more fiddly, but some of the loops aren't as even as others, so it does hang a little bit wonky, but that's fine. It gives it a little bit more of a rustic look, and which is why I think the beech driftwood would look really good for this part. So yes, once you get to the end, just double knot it and make sure it is all secure in place, and then your weaving wall hanging is complete. There you have weaving a wall hanging for the first time using 5 different weaving techniques to create lots of dimension and texture on the wall art. Now, most of these techniques are fairly straightforward once you've got your head around them. I guess the most complicated one I found was the pile one, just because you had to concentrate on how you are wrapping it around that sort of pen or dowel if you have a dowel. I don't know if I got it quite right, but I like the texture that it gave to the wall hanging anyway. So yes, let me know if you've got any tips and tricks for weaving in them comments below, because I think this is another sort of craft that I'm going to take under my wing and have a little bit more practice with. So any tips and tricks will be really useful. And if you've enjoyed the video, then please do give it a big thumbs up and let me know what you think about it as well in them comments below. And if you're new here, then why not hit that subscribe button to keep up with all my creative and crafty antics coming up onto the channel. There's lots more to come of various different crafts and DIYs, fingers crossed. Anyway, I've got lots planned, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any, and hit that notification bell as well, because that'll alert you each time my videos go live. And I also have a blog, Ames's Antics, which is linked down below and up above, because every video gets its own blog post as well, so sometimes there's just a little bit more information over on the blog for you to check out. And with that said, I will see you in next week's video, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and week, are able to do something creative and crafty to pass the time, like maybe try out a bit of weaving, try out a bit of weaving for the first time. And until the next one, bye.